So top 10 things you need to know about material design. So this is from my perspective of working with material design. The project that I'm on, we use that as the base of our design guidelines and a design system. So the first thing is who and why material design. Material design is Google's UX research. It is extensive. And I mean, if you think about the number of countries that Google is represented in and the number of devices that people use Google devices on, it's a lot of research, and they have great research for Android and iOS and on desktop. But it's still not everything. We have still seen that there are places where we're going to look for something on when should we use the, maybe there's a component that we need to create, but there's not any research on it. So I have listed there the material design website here, material.io. I reference it almost daily, depending on what I'm doing. The research versus implementation. Material design guidelines aren't always followed by Google's products at the same time. So if they have an old product, but they have new research on different components, it may not be implemented. So just because you see something that Google has done doesn't mean it's right. For instance, my favorite example is text fields. So you have what's called a standard, a filled, and an outlined. The standard with just the underline, I've read a couple of articles that have said that the completion rate for a form is 30% less if they use just the underline. When we previewed this to our team with, are we going to use the filled component? And no one likes the filled one. It looks too much like a default, or not like a default, like it's disabled. So we're going with the outline now. And because we initially started going with standard, which by the way is now no longer on the material design website, but it's on material UI site. The standard is no longer being used throughout Google. And we've had to go back, and there's like one line of code on this text input box that we have to change on every single instance now, that on all of our applications that are using text boxes, which is all of them. Color scheme. Color scheme is super important, and with material design guidelines, they suggest primary variant, secondary, and they have some background surface colors, but we found the need for info, warning, success, and about 1 billion values for gray. And if you look at, I'll talk about material UI in a later slide, but they also have info, warning, success. Oh, an error. I missed that one on the, oh, sorry, we have an error color here. And there's a ton of documentation on color usage and palettes and FIOIC compliance as well. Icons. There are tons and tons of open source icons that we can use. They are you can download them in SVG or in white or black. And if you download them in PNG and you use them, you try to use them in software, I will hunt you down. Please, for the love of God, do not use a PNG in software. SVGs are extensible. You can make them they're clean. They're not heavy as far as what you're adding to your project. The amount of code is just a couple lines of text, and you can change the color of them through code, where you can't do that with a PNG. And they do have guidelines for creating icons that seamlessly integrate with material design's icon set. So we have found, I think there are so far about 70, 75 icons that we have had to create that because we just didn't have them for our specific needs, even though they have hundreds of open source icons. And this is not just, we use material design first, and then we go to Font Awesome Pro if we can't find what we need for the open source icons. Even then, we still had about 70 so far that we had to create. And they have some great guidelines on how to create a very clean icon and to integrate, and what shapes to use for your icons, and to not have like a half pixel that makes the icon look blurry. So there's some great great guidelines on how to create your own icons should you need to. They have a lot of guidelines on ground typography. So not only do they have a very clear hierarchy for all of your typography, they've also got things like overline and a couple of different subtitles for you to use. You can also, if you needed to, generate the code. If you're not using a if you're not using a UI code base already, you can generate the code if you needed to, which I think is pretty cool for those people that aren't developers to be able to generate the code. So if you just had like an H1, it would generate the CSS for you. They have a bunch of components, documentation on how and when to use each component. They have do's and don'ts for each component, and it's very interactive. They even have a lot of videos to show you how to, like little very quick little videos that would be that would play right here on how these components interact with each other and when to use components, when not to use. One of my favorite ones that I've gone back and have been a really big stickler on is this fab, this floating action button. I've seen them in multiple different places and used for the wrong thing. They should absolutely be one per screen, and you put it on in mobile. It can be mobile should be the bottom right, and desktop is either bottom right or top left. And I've seen them kind of all over any kind of the border of the screen. And so we've really worked to get those using where they're supposed to be used and putting them in the correct place. Implementation. So material UI and material design are very different. Material design is the methodology and the research, whereas a material UI is the implementation of that research. We are using React as our code base, and I'm constantly on the material UI website to find the correct component. They also have a lot of the same documentation on material UI as you will find in material design. It's not as robust, but they do have for each component when to use this component and where this component should be. They offer the code in JavaScript or TypeScript, and for the most part, it's plug and play. It does allow you to have a customized theme, and it does allow you to have a much easier, much simpler customized theme than the one I created a year and a half ago. So that's a lot of fun. TypeScript uses the most current React hooks. It's a lot more stable. And there's dev resources if you wanted to implement another platform such as Flutter. I have just now heard of Flutter about 6 months ago, and it just seems like one more thing I don't have time to learn. But Flutter is one of the most recent platforms that people are getting on board with. Accessibility. Google really cares about making their products accessible. They have a lot of documentation. Every single component talks about accessibility and they care about things like it's not just the color, it's how you're using them so that they are accessible through a keyboard as well. They have with Material UI on all of their components have the proper area labels for 508 compliance so that the computer can kind of read the code to tell what this component is doing if in case a person is visually compromised. Motion. They have a lot of guidelines on motion that are really important. I've been in several meetings where someone says, oh man, gosh, that's going to take you, I don't know, like 85 iterations to get that animation correctly when we're talking about the speed and the timing. I said, nope, I'm giving it 3 mostly because we're going to go by these guidelines and they're not really going to have much of a choice. And it has helped these guidelines, not just with motion and animation, but these guidelines have helped with a lot of arguments. People will say, well, I think, well, I don't care what you think. The research says this. And I won't really say I don't care what you think, but I'll think it. but the research, having this research is really important because it takes a lot of people's opinions out of the equation and really streamlines everything. I've also had some clients ask for a really complex animation that doesn't really suit it would just annoy the user. It's a waste of time. Um, so when you're talking about the speed and complexity and duration, they have all of these listed in their motion guidelines, and they tell you when you should use motion. If you think back to, for those of us that are not millennials, if you think back to like the 90s when people did these flash websites and they have these complex intros that is big animation, that's so outdated and people will just be bored by it now because they want things to be very quick and at their fingertips. So you can use some very quick animations to delight the user, but it should be quick. It should be for a purpose and not just because it looks cool. This is, in my opinion, the most misused component are buttons. I have had clients ask me that they want this button to pop, not realizing that we already had a really good design system that just by having the correct button in the correct place, that button already pops. That you don't need to do anything else to make that the most visible item on the screen immediately. And you only want to have one primary button, one filled button per screen. That alone makes it the most important thing on the screen. And you would have, excuse me, your secondary button would be an outlined, and tertiary is text. I've also read, I don't think this is in material design guidelines, but I have read several articles on um, when you have two buttons on the screen and one is a confirm and one is like a cancel. Your confirm button would be on the right hand side and your cancel would be on the left. And you actually want your confirm button to be either your primary or secondary, and your cancel button to be your secondary or tertiary button. If you have a button inside a modal, then your modal is already the most important part of the screen, and it demands 100% of the user's attention. And you don't need to have a primary button on a modal. It should always be a secondary or tertiary button on a modal. And I feel like I went through that very fast and talked very fast. Any questions, comments?